Any operation performed on the ArcGIS platform ends up eventually to the geodatabase as a set of one or more queries. A zoom in or pan operation, for example, translates to multiple queries in the geodatabase or the database. SDE Intercept allows you to intercept and take a look at those queries and diagnose slow operations in your enterprise geodatabase. It also helps you pinpoint where the bottlenecks are and how can you optimize your application or the geodatabase. This is what we're going to discuss in this episode coming up. Hey guys, it's Hussein. Before we jump to the podcast, I just want to share with you some exciting news. I just published my new Kindle book on November 18th titled Learn GIS Programming with ArcGIS Online and the JavaScript API 4.9. That's the latest and greatest, shiniest stuff. Been working on this book for 6 months and I'm so excited that it's finally done and it's there. This book is designed for entry-level developers who are interested in building web applications on top of the ArcGIS Online with the JavaScript API. You don't have to have programming knowledge, or you just have to have like very basic programming knowledge. This book is written for Linux, Windows, and Mac users. Check it out. It will mean the world to me. Thank you very much. Check it out. www.husseinnasser.com. I'm going to put it in the description in the podcast. And with that said, let's get on with the show. What's up, y'all? This is your host, Hussein Nasser from iGeometry. Thank you so much for tuning in into this podcast. I really appreciate it, guys. In this episode, we'll discuss Intercept, SDE Intercept. We all been there, right? So, been working with our application, whether we built an Arc object application, an SOE, server object extension, the backend, or even just working with the native software, right? Just like trying to zoom in or just adding a layer, and it takes really long time, right? And we really don't know what's going on. We wanted to identify where the bottlenecks are. What is exactly what is slowing the application? Is it the application that we wrote? Is it the Geodatabase? Is it the ArcGIS platform? Where can we identify the performance bottlenecks, essentially? And especially if you have an enterprise geodatabase, it can become challenging to determine where in the stack your performance problems there are. So what you want to do is, let's say you have an Oracle geodatabase, and you have set that up, and you published a feature service perhaps, and then you built an application, right? I don't know, JavaScript application, and on top of that you built some widgets, and your end user start using the application, and he says, okay, I'm using this function and it's really slow. So you really need to break this up. There are, as you can see, there are many layers here, not ArcGIS layers, but actual physical layers of software, right? The first layer is your widget, the second one is the ArcGIS API, right? The third one is the feature service, then goes back to the ArcGIS server, and the tuning there that you can do goes back, dive deep into web adapters, even before that, any web servers, networking, and finally diving deep into the geodatabase, right? Into a set of queries. So let's assume you have written an app that it does a bunch of queries, but those queries are really slow. And you, for simplicity, let's say that we identified that we want to know that where is this bottleneck, right? What exactly is slowing this application down? So essentially you would want to start with way down at the geodatabase, right? And this layer called the SDE layer, we don't like to refer to it as SDE anymore, but that's the layer that talks to the database immediately. So you want to enable this SDE Intercept, and I'm gonna link I'll add a link below in this description. You can in the show notes, you can check out how you can enable that. And then on the client machine that talks directly to your database. So this could be if you're talking on a client server direct connect from, like, say, ArcGIS Pro or ArcMap. You want to do this setup, this enabling of these queries on that machine. If you have an ArcGIS server, you want to do that setup on the ArcGIS server machine, because do it on the client that talks immediately to the geodatabase, essentially, right? Because that is where the queries will be emitted, essentially. So you want to enable those first. It's like a simple Windows environment setup. And once you do that, you would basically perform your operation, and then once you perform your operation, you start that intercepting. Then you look at the intercept log. You can see it's not actual SQL queries, because that's another level of things that you can do at the database. I'm going to talk about it in another episode, but that will give you some an over view of the things that run after this operation. Let's like say you did a simple zoom in, right, on your map, and that will trigger a fleet of requests from the client up into the server, and the server up until the final geodatabase calls. And that will tell you this. You say, hey, I did a query here, it took this much, it returns this much, and that for example took this this much time, right? And you can see the time clearly, right? So, and you can ask yourself now, let's say the actual wall time the user click this button that you built, right, as an application, and then it says, let's say it takes, I don't know, 30 seconds to complete, right? If you look at the SDE Intercept and the queries, the sum of all these queries only took 1.5 seconds, then if you think about it, as long as those queries make sense, right, you expect those queries, if they are very heavy queries, to take 1.5 seconds. That is fine, right? Depends on the nature of the queries. But 30 seconds, where did the other 29 seconds go, right? So obviously the database is not doing all this task, right? So the slowness is not from the queries, from the SQL queries, from the geodatabase queries. There's something higher up the stack. And then you start thinking, okay, the query immediately returns, so that's not the SQL problem. That's not the SDE Intercept problem. It's not the geodatabase. So you don't need to do anything. However, sometimes you would notice that a certain function that you built takes around 10 seconds, and then you take a look at the SDE Intercept, and you see actually a query that takes, I don't know, 7 or 8 seconds just to complete. And then you start asking yourself questions, right? Oh, what are we doing here? Oh, we're just returning all the rows in the table. Do we really need to do that? That's probably a bad idea, right? You don't just do an unbounded query, right? Or we notice that, for example, in SQL Server does not like to do like select star. Any database hates that. We should not do that, select star, unless you absolutely need it. right? So whatever fields you need, just pick those fields, because it's really big deal for the database to pick all these fields for you. Okay, so you would pick all the fields that you absolutely need, and you start fixing your application. Sometimes, like this case, it's actually a bug in the application that it's just asking for everything. You shouldn't really do that. You only ask for things you really absolutely need, or page it. At least if you're like showing a table with the rows, you show the first 10 rows, and then you ask for the next and the next and the next, right? You never ask for everything at one point. So that's another tuning. So first thing we said, could be never the database at all. So nothing wrong with the database, it's just the application is doing something wrong, right? The second thing is, yes, the query in the database is taking 9 seconds, and the reason is because you're selecting everything and you're selecting all rows, right? All columns and all rows. Another final thing that you can notice is actually a bad query, essentially, or a bad tuning in the database. Let's say, for example, you're trying to query, I don't know, an integer field, and that field is not index, right? So usually like a query that takes three seconds to select certain number, like a count, or you're selecting a field and that takes like 2 or 3 seconds. That's slow, right? You want to index that. You can index, for example, index that column, get slightly more performance. And yeah, so that's essentially examples of where SDE Intercept might be useful for you guys. So hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm gonna see you in the next one. You guys stay awesome. Thank you again for tuning in this podcast. See you in the next one. Goodbye.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.